Hi, baddies. Welcome back to another episode of Terra's Baddies Club. I am your host, Terra Newell, and today I'm so excited because we are doing every other with this episode with Terra's Baddies Club, getting them out bi-weekly. And so that really makes me happy. There's also a lot of life changes coming up ahead, like moving from my place that I have been in for 6 years. There was one point where I was going to move to LA, but that didn't quite work out. They wanted to see my tax return stuff, and that was a little bit too far for me to try to move into an apartment. So we have Penny Lane here with me. She is my Pomeranian, my rescue Pomeranian from Barkin' Bitches. If you are watching YouTube, you can see her cute little face on the screen. But if you're not, you're just going to have to think how cute she is listening to the audio. But today's guest, we have Danielle Dr. Slakoff. She is associate producer of criminal justice at California State University, Sacramento, and she is nationally recognized. She talks about media and true crime, co-victims, and we're going to get into her research today about 2 papers, and she's also working on a 3rd paper. So let's get into this episode with Dr. Danielle Slakoff. Hi, Danielle. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast today. I'm so excited because we connected on the Vice documentary, and it was about ethics, which is right up your alley.
Absolutely. It's so good to see you. It's been too long, I think, since your ethical podcasting course last year. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Well, for the people that don't know who you are, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So I am an associate professor at Sacramento State University. I am in the Division of Criminal Justice. I would call myself a criminologist and a victimologist, and most of my research has been on the media and the intersection with crime. So the early part of my career, I covered a lot about how victims are portrayed in the media, specifically across race. I have written a lot about the missing white woman syndrome. But in more recent years, I've been working a lot more on true crime and true crime media, and most recently on the ethics of true crime. And then my secondary area is domestic violence. So I do a lot of work in those 2 areas. Another kind of interesting tidbit is that I did get my bachelor's degree in journalism, which I think is very relevant to the work that I still do, because I care a lot about our media and making sure that it's ethical and factual and accurate and all of those things. So even though I made a big switch from journalism to criminal justice, it's still so important to me.
I think that's really interesting too, because journalists have to hold themselves to a different set of ethics in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And those ethics have different guidelines that you have to go by. And so it's just kind of intertwining the both of them in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can talk about this more when we get to the research studies. But one of the things that co-victims talked about was just an invasion of privacy that can happen in true crime. And what we were really surprised by, we being my co-author, Dr. Kelly Bowling, and I, was that it was sometimes journalists that were invading people's privacy, which is against their code of ethics. You know, it's written in the code of ethics not to do that. And yet we heard from co-victims that it was happening, not just from like content creators that are not journalists, but also happening from journalists. So that was really surprising to us.
That's so interesting. And I think too, like, you've done a lot since the documentary that we were in too.
Mm-hmm.
You've done these peer interviews, these 2 paperworks, and now you're working on your 3rd one, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, correct. So just to tell you a little bit about the study and how it came to be. So well, I don't know how much detail to get into, but I will say it this way. I used to be really, I used to consume a lot of true crime, mostly for, criminal justice reasons, wanting to find stuff for classes, talk about it with people, often with a very analytical lens, but I would consume a lot of it. And I think after I had somebody very close to me, my father, pass away from cancer, I started to recognize grief very clearly within true crime. And I think once you lose somebody, you start to see grief everywhere or in ways that you didn't before. And so I remember in this particular case, I was listening to a podcast and I could just hear the immense grief from a family member. And it just made me look at true crime very differently, because like, here is this person who's grieving, talking about their loved one in a very vulnerable state. And it sounds silly, but it like almost like flipped a switch for me that, there are these deep, powerful, very, very emotional stories underneath true crime that is so much more complex and nuanced than I had realized before my own grief experience. So, with that in mind, I reached out to Dr. Kelly Bowling because she had done amazing research on true crime consumers. Consumers, we could talk about that for a whole hour, but true crime consumers have so many unique reasons for engaging with the genre. It's not just one size fits all. Some people, yes, do it because they're bored and they find it entertaining. But there's also a lot of survivors who listen to true crime, who want to make sense of what happened to them. There's also people who want to learn like safety tips and warning signs. Your story, Terra, one of power and resilience and fighting back and protecting yourself. Like, no, I know for sure you have helped people in in sharing your story, right? So consumers are not a monolith.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Kelly had done amazing work. She reminded me, I forgot this. She reminded me that I reached out to her on Twitter and complimented her work and just said, like, I would love to work with you. I forgot that that's how we met, but I am a big believer in reaching out to people that inspire you. So I'm so glad I did. And so, Kelly and I have written several things together now. We did actually do a paper on grief and true crime podcasts and what that looks like. But ultimately, the thing that I really wanted to do was to talk to the loved ones of victims and missing people, which we called co-victims. And that was really the goal. So we have written 2 papers. The 2 papers are on the positive effects of true crime, according to co-victims, and the negative effects. And then we are currently working on a 3rd paper, the final paper from this data set. I can't say too much about it because it's in, the pre-production writing phase, but it's such important work, and I'm really grateful to the 20 co-victims that we spoke to that gave us their time. The interviews averaged 65 minutes, so they gave us an hour of their time to talk all things true crime and ethics, and we're very proud of the work that we've done, but we're also really excited for the upcoming 3rd paper.
I feel like I know at least 5 people that I talked to that they were like, I won't say who, but they were like, oh, I did that with Danielle. It was great. They enjoyed their time with you, and it was really fun. I felt that everyone had a great experience with you that I talked to, and it was really important for them to get this education out there and to get this research, because a lot of them didn't even have it in them to do normal interviews per se with any other podcast, but they wanted to do this research with you.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. And it's interesting that you say that, because the way that academic writing works is that, we write something, we submit it to a journal, generally 2 or 3 people read it. It's blinded, so they don't know who it is that's writing it. And they give feedback. And then we get it back and we revise it based on their feedback. And it's, a very iterative, reflective process. It can take months to years. It is a long process. I will say the relationship I have with Kelly, my co-author, is so important and so special. I was thinking to myself, like, we started this project in 2023. It's 2026 now. I speculate the 3rd paper will come out, hopefully, fingers crossed, sometime in 2027. And so, like, that's 4 years. That's a long-term relationship that I've had with Dr. Bowling. But, I think that speaking to these 20 co-victims was something that I hoped would happen, but was always, it's weird, I think, because I know how hard it is to talk about loss, and my loss was, cancer, a natural death. I think with so many of the co-victims, like, this thing happened that completely turned their life around with almost 0 warning. And so it's just a very, very tough thing to talk about. And so I recognize very deeply how vulnerable and open all 20 of them had to be to talk about this. And something I've reflected on a lot in the research is just that even though we only asked them about the media and what was the media attention like and what would you say to producers, those kinds of questions, so much of the harm or the crime that happened or their loved one disappearing, the media attention for some of them happened immediately after that. And so the trauma of their loss or the disappearance is like very deeply entwined with the media. And I think that was something that I knew consciously, like if I thought about it intellectually, I knew that. But I think in talking to all 20 people, it just really came through how powerful the media is, how harmful it can be, but also how helpful it can be. And I'm really proud of the work that we did, but it wouldn't have happened without those 20 people who gave us their time and their energy and their vulnerability. So I just continue to be so grateful, like have immense gratitude for those 20 co-victims we spoke to.
Well, I think it's really interesting the word co victim because not a lot of people know what that is. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people have pushed back, especially on my social media, being like, why do we need to use this word? I think it's very insensitive for people to first say something like that. But I think people do need to understand why it's used.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. The truth is that co-victim, that definition is contested in the literature, meaning that there's no one definition. So for Dr. Bowling and I, Kelly, we decided to go with co-victim being the loved one of a victim or a missing person. That's what we defined as a co-victim. What we realized very quickly, though, in our research with the 20 co-victims is that several of our participants are connected to the perpetrator as well, generally in domestic violence situations. And some of them were direct survivors, meaning that not only did their loved one get harmed or sometimes killed by this person, but they also were harmed directly. And so we had a lot of co victims that were also survivors. And we talk about that in both of the published pieces that we set out only to talk to the loved ones, right? But the truth is that real life is much more complicated than just one term. And we had several participants that were also survivors, often from the same perpetrator.
I think that's a really beautiful term because it kind of gives you a dynamic where you can be under one category in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
where you could be a survivor, you could be the mom of a survivor, you could be the mom of someone that was unfortunately unalived, or
Mm-hmm.
you could be the mother or the daughter of a missing person or a cousin of a missing person,
Mm-hmm.
someone that was affected separately outside of just being directly affected, like
Mm-hmm.
directly assaulted by that perpetrator, but you could still be a co-victim too.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that in academia and just in general, as human beings, we love to like put people into categories because it helps us make sense of the world. But the truth is that it's much more complicated than that. And like I said, we set out to, okay, we'll talk to the loved ones of victims and missing people. But in reality, a lot of them were also, survivors of the same people. So I think it adds important nuance and also just adds this extra layer, right? Which is that when somebody is out there, for example, speaking about the harm that I'm just making this up, their brother caused, they may have also been victimized by their brother and they are talking about it, from both lenses. So I just think it's important nuance and context that a lot of people don't realize. That really bothers me that people would even like comment something like that to you because I know with you and your mom's story, like, you and your mom both suffered great harm from this person. So I'm sorry that people are trying to make you feel some type of way about using that term.
It's more so when I try to educate and I'm saying, hey, this is the word you should use, then
Mm-hmm.
people are pushing back on it saying,
Interesting.
hey, no. And I'm saying, hey, are you, by the way, affected by anything to do with this?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think the thing too is that I think with any loss, any death, any disappearance, there are these ripples outward. And I think that for us, it was really important for us to see, who are the people closest to these stories that have experienced it, kind of from the inside out. And that honestly are so frequently the centerpiece of true crime. Like so many of our participants had been parts of true crime documentaries, productions, podcasts, speaking about their loved one. And they're doing that often in moments of extreme distress, loss. And so that just really was important to Dr. Bowling and I to make sure that we really spoke to the people closest to these stories about what happened and what it was like. And like I said, I just feel immense gratitude for them because, like I said, the trauma was very closely linked to what happened with the media for so many of them. And in some cases, the media made them feel really awful, felt, taken advantage of. Some people felt lied to, that things were produced and edited in ways that were not, told to them. And some people said they felt like they were caught by surprise by how things turned out in the final product. Like just things like that I think the everyday person would struggle with. But then to think about it happening after a crime or after a disappearance is just very, very harrowing, honestly. So I just felt lucky that they talked to us about it.
I love that. I love that they talked to you about that, not that it
Mhm.
happened to them.
Yeah.
And I think that in the media, there's so many nuances with it, and there's so many commonalities. Other than those that you just name, what were some of the other big things that happen in the media to them?
Yeah, so I would love to just kind of jump into some of the findings that we had. So I'll start with the harms or the negative effects of true crime, and then maybe we can end on a happier, happier note and talk about some of the positive effects that co-victims shared. So in terms of the negative effects, there were 5 primary ones that came out, and I did want to mention that we spoke to 20 people, 20 co-victims. We were open to anybody who had experienced their loved one's story be covered by true crime. So we had some people who had had it happen, several times. And then we had some people that had had it, one person said that they speculated it had been over 100 times that their story had been covered. So we had a huge range in terms of what we call coverage intensity. Very, very interesting academic term, just means how much attention did it get. We had a huge range. But the thing was, and this is something I keep telling people, it really didn't matter if it was somebody who had had it happen 5 times or 100. The stories were remarkably similar. The main findings were across all, they were across everybody. The people who experienced this, it was really across all the participants. And I kind of want people to understand that even if they're only covered, their loved one's stories only covered 5 times, that doesn't mean they're not experiencing these harms. And so, yeah, I thought that was something that was interesting to me. So, in terms of the big findings, number 1 was that co-victims described true crime as being very inaccurate, meaning just sometimes blatant falsehoods, things that didn't happen being said in there. Some people said to us that it was, very, very irrelevant to the crime and disappearance, and that those falsehoods were very problematic for that. Other people said it was just, some details were wrong, but then that had them questioning the overall research that was done. And, some of the stories that people shared with us, people talked about watching documentaries and just being like, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And just how that really feels awful as a co victim. People who, one participant said that their case had been going on for 37 years and that a lot of what had gone on in the media was not accurate. And one of the quotes that has stayed with me since the day that I heard it in our interview. One of our participants is the sister of a missing person and talked about how there's so much misinformation about her sister. And she said, quote, I could never correct all the misinformation. And if I tried to, then who would be looking for my sister? End quote. And that was just something that the moment I heard it, I just was like, I mean, that's the whole thing, right? Is that when things are inaccurate, they may not go challenge, and that's because these people are trying to like get justice, find their loved one, they're grieving, like there's just so much going on, and that is really, really, like I said, harrowing. It just really shocks people. I think the word true in true crime does a lot of heavy lifting, does a lot of positive PR for true crime, because the truth is, talking to these co-victims, a lot is not accurate. And that is something that really surprises people. I think that, like, just at the baseline, I think when people hear true crime, they assume it's all true. And so I think that was one of those findings that on its face might not seem like a big deal, but when you have co-victims telling you, no, like, no, things are inaccurate and it's harmful to us, I think that we should take notice of that. Co-victims talked a lot about how sensationalized true crime is, how focused it is on like the gory, violent details, and how that can really add additional trauma. Something that Dr. Bowling and I talked about is that it can leave co-victims feeling like what happened, or that their loved one doesn't actually matter, that it's like the gory details that matter, it's the splashy headline that matters to people, and that can feel really awful to those co-victims. There was a lot about co-victims' privacy being invaded. And this, I talked about this a lot when I recently gave a public lecture about this. It was really fascinating to Dr. Bowling and I, because so often with the co-victims, they would say that, creators and journalists were invading their privacy, putting cameras in their face in these like really horrific moments, sometimes at their home, sometimes in public, just coming up to them and wanting quotes and stuff. But we were really surprised because a lot of them said it was real journalists with credentials and training that were doing this. And I think we would have assumed that it was people without those credentials that were causing that particular type of harm. But actually, in our study, a lot of them said it was like real journalists that were causing this harm. So that was really shocking. I think because I have a degree in journalism, Dr. Bowling is a professor in a mass communications and advertising space. Like, I think we both kind of hoped that professional journalists wouldn't be part of that. But that's not what we found. The co-victims were very clear that often it was the traditional like news media that started the invasion of privacy. And then we say it in the paper. If this is how professional journalists are acting, then why would we be surprised that true crime producers are doing the same thing? They, in my opinion, this is just me saying this, like, our journalists should be setting a higher standard for the content production. So that was really, really surprising to us. I think, this next one, I'm sure you have a ton of stories, Terra. A lot of the co-victims spoke about uncomfortable interactions with true crime consumers. And it's interesting because it was such a broad spectrum. Like, some people would say, they would, add me on Facebook and say, I'm so sorry for your loss. On its face, that may not look bad. But, then that person is like having to be like, oh, it's okay, and it's like, I don't know you and you don't know my mom. So, that might not on its face seem like an uncomfortable interaction, but for co-victims that are actively grieving and doing media interviews and all these things, like, that can just feel like a lot. And then, of course, we had like some extreme trolling. We had one participant say that a troll told him, if you hadn't have said anything, your loved one would still be alive, and basically saying it was his fault that his loved one was harmed. And we write about that in the paper. So like, it's a broad spectrum for the uncomfortable interactions. We kind of make a caveat that there's like trolls, right? There's people that are purposely trying to cause harm and confusion to these co-victims. But either way, that's something that these people did not ask for this to happen to them. They did not ask to be at the center of these stories and then to have these uncomfortable interactions. I think 2 participants use the term verbal diarrhea. Like, people like will just verbally like tell me all these things. And it's like, okay, that's a lot. And then finally, the last negative impact was that co-victims don't have any control over how true crime is produced or edited. And then some of them took it a step further and said, I didn't even know it was being made in the first place. So that was something that I think was very important for them to talk about. Just this idea that they shared their story, but then the final product looked very different than how they were expecting it and how that could cause harm. And a lot of them talked about, all the stuff about my loved ones in the public domain, everything is out in the, open. So they can put it out, whoever it is, whatever the production is, they can put it out there and there's nothing we as the family can do about it. And so a lot of them talked about that being another really negative impact of true crime. And like I said, Tara, I'm sure that you have experienced so many of these as well. So I'm sure that as I was sharing those, you probably were running through your own lists. But yeah, those were our 5 big takeaways in terms of the negatives.
Okay, I think that those are so prominent of things that people need to think about,
Mm-hmm.
because with that, it's not just one person being affected, it's so many people being affected. And then you have these consumers that are engaging and just giving even more into it in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. People are very fascinated by true crime consumers and like we talked in the paper, we talked about like this idea of parasocial fans. And like, we kind of basically say that that doesn't seem like what's going on because it doesn't seem like the goal is for the consumers to be friends with the co victims. It seems more that a lot of consumers want to solve the crime or like solve the disappearance. And so it's very unique, I think, to the true crime culture to have these like uncomfortable interactions happening. And like I said, there was a broad spectrum. I think just recognizing that every, message, no matter how well intentioned, that's emotional labor that co-victim might feel like they have to do now to respond. And so, I will say, because I teach about this, I teach a media and crime course to a classroom full of criminal justice students. And so many of them will look at me like I have 6 heads because I'm telling them people are messaging co-victims and they're like, "What? Like who would do that? Why would you message somebody's like sister and say, "I'm so sorry." Like that's going way beyond, And I just tell them like, just like any fandom, we have some like more casual fans and then we have some like extreme consumers, just like the Swifties, right? Or the Star Trek, or the Trekkies. Like there's a spectrum and not everybody is engaging to that level, but it is happening. And to that point, the Vice News documentary, like one of the things I love about the documentary that you and I are both in is that they talk about this. There are some extreme consumers. We're not talking about everybody that's consuming, but there is this group that takes it to an extreme.
I also love in the Vice documentary that they started off with her in a Grateful Dead t-shirt. I was wearing a Grateful Dead t-shirt. We both had Australian Shepherds.
Mhm.
And I was like, are they trying to say something here? But I think they wanted to show that there are similarities with these people, but the worlds are so different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. But getting into the good stuff
Yes.
now, what are the good effects of social media, or not social media? What are the good effects of media?
Yeah. So we wrote these, so I'll just give you some behind the scenes tea that I don't know that anybody wants, but I'll tell you. So we wrote these papers pretty consecutively and they were both under review around the same time. So we didn't know when they would come out in order. So there was no, like, people ask me that, like, was there a special order these were meant to come out in? No, we just, with the peer review process, it can take months to years. So the positive paper, I think, is extremely important because myself included, I think human beings in general, like we can be very interested in the negative effects. But I think it's also, and that's how we end the paper, it's also important to recognize the benefits because it's a nuanced conversation, it's a nuanced picture. And so many of the co victims stated that, yes, there are positive effects, but, or things are created factually, if things are made with our consent, if it's researched well, then yes, there are positive effects. So I want to be clear, there's some caveats, okay? But it was very clear in these interviews with these 20 co-victims that, yeah, there are some positive effects. I think the most obvious one, and a couple of people have been said, like, well, obviously the positive is this. The most obvious is bringing attention to cold cases and unsolved cases and just generating awareness about stories. Some people said it's, specific to their loved one. True crime has helped bring attention to my loved one. Other people said, like, it brings attention to these stories that matter. So that's, I think, the most obvious positive, is that it can raise awareness about cases. The other two I found to be really interesting. So I'm a criminal justice professor. I teach a bunch of different classes for the department. The co-victims spoke very clearly about true crime being a vehicle to educate, specifically about criminal justice problems and issues with the criminal justice system. And that, to me, like, that's music to my ears, right? Because it's important to teach about these issues. I think the more that we are able to teach students and practitioners about these issues, the better. So that was a really amazing, positive finding. The last one is the title of the paper. The paper is titled "Media Pressure is What Makes Law Enforcement Move." And that is because the co-victims spoke about the media being able to place pressure on criminal justice officials, law enforcement, DA, and others. And that was, out of all, to be honest, out of both studies, I think that was the finding that surprised me the most. Because, well, it's two things. Number one, I feel like that is an indictment on the criminal justice system. I think that co-victims saying, oh, we use the media to put pressure on law enforcement to give us updates or to conduct searches, or, I have to use the media to get a response from the DA because they don't answer me unless I use my media email address, and then they'll respond. I think that does not paint a positive portrait of the criminal justice system. And I think that is, on the other hand, that shows how powerful the media is, right? That law enforcement, DA, and otherwise, they're going to respond if the media puts pressure on. And so I think that really speaks to how powerful the media is in a way that is really important, but also, like there's just this part of me that's like, they shouldn't have to do that. Like, they shouldn't have to go through that. They shouldn't have to use the media to place pressure. And that, so there, it's a kind of this double-edged sword. And I think for me, hearing from so many co-victims that, they weren't responding until the media came out. We're having true crime fans write letters and then they're responding to the letter writing campaign. That's a very important positive. I think that speaks a lot to, the possible positives of the community, the true crime fans that, for example, do letter writing campaigns or things like that. So it is more nuanced than I think people realize. I think an important part of this, though, is that so many of the co-victims said, yes, of course there's positives, but it still has to be created ethically. It still needs to be factual. And in the perfect world, they'd get our consent. So I think that it's important to mention those caveats. Like, there still needs to be work to be done to make sure that it's doing right by the co-victims.
I have a question now, because after hearing all of this, do you feel that there needs to be a certain set of guidelines for the media with everything?
Yeah, so I think, we have the Professional Journalist Code of Conduct, and professional journalists, Society of Professional Journalists, have a code of ethics. I definitely think there needs to be something similar in the true crime space. And to be clear, there are people doing amazing work in this area already. There's important campaigns out there like the Engage with Empathy campaign, so many others. I think that as Kelly and I move forward, we're definitely thinking about, can we create something or a checklist or something to that effect that can help people in that way? So definitely, I think that our findings, I'm very, obviously, I think a lot about this work in this study, and I'm very proud of it. I do think the studies are really important because there's not a lot of work out there about co-victims and their experiences. There really isn't. And true crime is changing so fast. anybody with a microphone and the internet can create a podcast. And because the barrier to entry is so low, that means that people are entering the field that may not have any of that training. They may not have any of the guidelines to follow. And you're catching me on a good day. You're catching me on an optimist day. I feel like most people want to do right by others and might just need the guidelines to help them. And so, yeah, I definitely think there needs to be guidelines. I know that there are already some really awesome ones. I think a big reason why I'm now in this moment trying to talk about this work more, even though I was nervous about talking about it publicly a little bit because I didn't know how it would be received. But I think I'm in a space now where, as an educator, I want people to know about the work that we did. I want people to know what these co-victims talked about. And I am hopeful for change in true crime. I think that's why Kelly and I both agreed to do this work. And I honestly think that's why the co-victims agreed, because they want the academic side to come into this conversation as well.
I feel that I can ask you a million questions, but we don't have that amount of time. So we're going to get into what it was like to talk about this research at a bar, especially with going in with being prepared for everything you told me earlier. And I got nervous for you because I just heard the word bar and then thought about drunk men.
Yeah, so I have to shout out, it's called Common Knowledge. It's here in Sacramento where I live. It's a relatively new company where they are bringing, what their idea is bringing in top experts to talk about issues, but in bar settings. And I think I know Zach, the creator, pretty well now. He's awesome. You know, his view on it was bringing in these speakers into places where we can have real conversations, where people aren't connected to their phones all night. And you know, this is a whole broader conversation around fake news and, you know, AI and so many other reasons why it's getting harder and harder to trust expertise or even to know who an expert is. So I think he was really like, let's create a space for experts to come out and connect in person. So I did just recently give a talk on these two studies. It was 45 minutes long in a bar. I was extremely nervous. I prepared to an extreme. I think I ran through it fully 4 or 5 times in preparation, not to mention all the time I spent with the slides and making sure everything looked great. But I think for me, I was nervous because I didn't know how it would be received. This was people who were paying money to come hear me speak. And I assumed, and I was correct in this assumption, that the vast majority of people were true crime fans. And I think because and I asked that at the very beginning, how many of you are true crime fans? I didn't count, but my guess would be close to 90% said that, yes, they were fans of true crime. And so I think I was very nervous about how are people going to receive a very mixed bag when it comes to the ethics of true crime. And I think ultimately what I constantly go back to is that I do think people want to do better, but sometimes people just don't know. And I think that when they heard some of these stories, some of these co-victim stories, and about the inaccuracies and about the sensationalism and the lack of privacy and consumers saying these things to people, like, I think there was a moment, and I could see it, where people were like, oh my gosh, like, this is not good. This is really bad, actually. And, you know, I had several people tell me, like, I'm really rethinking my relationship with true crime. Not necessarily saying no more at all, but who are ethical creators that I can follow? Who are victim-centered creators that I can follow? Who are people who care about co-victims that I can follow? So, you know, I think as an educator, you know, I have this thing where if I'm afraid to do it, that usually means I should do it because my fear is like, you know, I need to push past it. And I think I didn't know how it would be received. And I think the fact that I was over preparing so much was because I just knew that I wanted to stick the landing and do right by the participants in our study, do right by Dr. Bowling. And I walked in there knowing I was going to do that. And so I was able to walk in very confidently that the participants trusted us. And now I'm going to tell their stories in this format. The audience was predominantly women, which is very similar to the true crime audience. But yeah, it was received extremely, extremely well. And to be honest, now I'm in a place where I'm like, I want to talk about it so much more now. Like it was almost like the band-aid got ripped off. And now I feel like, okay, I can talk to people about this in person. People are going to be receptive to this, even though it might make them uncomfortable.
Yes, you just need to talk about it more and more and more now. And if you want Danielle on your podcast, your
Mhm.
media, hit her up. So there's so much more we could talk about. And I want to get into documentaries that you have worked on.
Mhm.
But for the people dropping off here, where can we find you on social media? Where can we support you? Where can we support this research?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for asking that. So, I'm pretty easy to find on social media because my handle's the same on everything. It's at D Slakoff PhD. Slakoff Slakoff, like Frank. D Slakoff PhD. I am most active right now on Instagram, at LinkedIn, and not so much on Twitter anymore, but I'm the same handle in all three places.
I love that. I feel like I'm less active on Twitter now, too.
Yeah. Instagram, it's interesting because I think, just as a woman in the world, I think Instagram, I have this like visceral reaction to it because it's hard not to like compare and do all these things on there. But I do
Yeah.
think there's something beautiful about like seeing what people's lives look like. I know it's a highlight reel, but seeing what people's lives look like. And, it's been a really good way to talk about the work that I'm doing and the awesome work that I get to share with people. So, yeah, Instagram is definitely where I'm the most active.
I love it. Well, perfect. Check her out on Instagram and we'll get into the Patreon. Thank you, baddies, for listening to today's episode of Terra's Baddies Club. I am just so excited to talk about ethical true crime. I know this week there was a post from Alicia. She is a survivor, and if you check out her story, but she has a page about missing people because she was a missing person and she was found, she was abducted. But go check out her page because she talked about going to the serial killer speakeasy, and that is something that I've spoken about. I've actually had meeting with these people, but I decided at the end of the day, you can't really make anything about serial killer speakeasy really ethical. So go check out her video. And if you like this episode, please give 5 stars, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and if you're watching from YouTube, go leave a review down below. We love to hear your comments and feedback, and hit the like button. And until next time, I'm Terra Newell, and thank you so much for listening to Terra's Baddies Club.